an offering?
Absolutely. For you?
$4.
Coming up next, the Eaton-Peabody Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce gubernatorial primary debate for the Republican Party, held at Rangeley Hall on the Eastern Maine Community College campus, located in Bangor, Maine. The candidates include William Beardsley, Steve Abbott, Paul LePage, Matt Jacobson, Les Otten, and Peter Mills. This program was produced by My Video Productions, MVP, putting community events on television since 2002. Funding for MVP is proudly provided by Page Employment and Seaboard Security. Thank you for watching this program, and now we join Mike Ballesteros, Chair of the Board of the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce.
Good evening, and welcome to the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce Eaton-Peabody gubernatorial primary debate. I am Mike Ballesteros, Dean of Development and Business Services here at Eastern Maine Community College, and I also serve as the 2010 Board Chair for the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce. Eastern Maine Community College is pleased to host tonight's debate featuring 6 of the Republican candidates for governor. But before we get started, I have a few announcements about upcoming events. Our next early bird breakfast is to be held Wednesday, April 28th at Jeff's Catering and Brewer. The topic for the breakfast will be the referendum question, which will appear on the June ballot. The question will ask voters to decide whether or not to reject the new law that lowers Maine's income tax and replaces that revenue by making changes to the sales tax. We will explore this issue, presenting both sides of the debate with panelists Wick Johnson, President for Kennebec Technologies, State Senator Trahan, and Albert DeMillo. The breakfast series is sponsored by Oxford Networks. The Chamber's Business Expo is set to take place on May 6 at the Bangor Civic Center. There will be exhibitors, seminars, a fabulous reception, great prizes, and a lot of networking opportunities. Please check at the registration table outside for more information. Call the Chamber or register online at thebangorregion.com. One of the prizes that attendees could win is an Apple iPad, which is generously donated by the event's premier sponsor, again, Oxford Networks. Our basic sponsors include Bangor International Airport, Pinnacle Development, Concentra, and Eastern Maine Development Corporation. Our reception sponsors for this event are Events by Mackey and Maine Equipment Rental. And our media sponsors are the Maine Edge, WVOM, Maine Biz, and WVII Channel 7. The Democratic candidates for governor will take part in the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce Eaton-Peabody gubernatorial primary debate to be held on May 3rd at Husson University's Gracie Theater. Please contact the Chamber for tickets and further information for that debate. We'd like to thank the college and Eaton-Peabody for sponsoring this event this evening. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Catherine Pegram, anchor and reporter at WABI TV5. Please welcome me in joining her to the stage.
Thank you for that introduction tonight. Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to outline our ground rules before we get started with this event. Then we'll turn it over to the candidates to have some introductory remarks and move on from there. I'd like to first ask members of the audience to please silence your cell phones or other electronic devices here and ask that you refrain from any vocal demonstrations of support or opposition during the course of our debate. Our ground rules do state that audience members who persist in those sorts of demonstrations will be asked to leave, so please remember that. As to the format, in just a minute, each of the candidates will be given a 2-minute opening statement. After that, I'll pose a series of questions. Some of the questions were crafted by the leadership of the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce. Others were submitted by chamber members, and I'll identify the author in those instances when we get to those questions. Each candidate will be allotted 1 minute to respond to a question. I'll vary the order in which they'll be able to respond, and as we get to the end, I may ask some of the candidates to limit their response to a shorter time period so that we can end on time and get in as many questions as possible. We do have a timekeeper seated over here to the side of the stage, and what you can't quite see is that she'll display a yellow indicator light when a candidate has 15 seconds left to respond, and a red indicator light when the response time has been used up. Any candidate who persists in going over that time can have their allotted time shortened in their next response, so we hope that you please keep that in mind. If any candidate is singled out by opposition for criticism, I may choose to give that criticized candidate 30 seconds for rebuttal. And I'll also let you know that we'd like to take a brief break right around 7:15 to allow our videographer for Community Access Television to change his tapes. So we'll take a breather in about 40 minutes or so. Those are our ground rules. I'd like to move on to our opening statements, and we're going to start at the end of the table with Steve Abbott and then work our way across. You have 2 minutes, Mr. Abbott.
Thank you very much for having us here tonight. I'm also impressed that we have rules. We've been together for about 50 debates. I think this is the first time we've actually had a format outlined with rules. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name's Steve Abbott, and for those of you who haven't met me, I'm from Orono, and that's something I've always been very proud of and important to me. My first job was delivering the Bangor Daily News with my brother Scott, who's here tonight. I'll confess we hated it, but still, I was glad to have that opportunity. And growing up in this area was special to me. It was special to have the opportunity to play in the high school basketball tournament here in Bangor, special to have the opportunity to drive over the old bridge when it used to hum, and it was special to have the opportunity to have George Hale wake us up on WABI at 5:45 every morning. And, but not only is this area special to me, it's special to the rest of Maine as well, and it's really important to our economic future that the Bangor area succeed and do well, and it's important for all of Maine. Bangor is the transportation crossroads for northern and eastern Maine. It's the economic center for northern and eastern Maine. It's the service center for northern and eastern Maine. It's also the academic center for northern and eastern Maine, and I would say for the whole state as well. And it's really important that the state support this region and understand the history of this region, what it's meant to Maine, and what it's going to mean to Maine's future. This is an area I come to often. My parents are here as well, Walt and Carol Abbott. Many of you know my dad from his work at the university, and know my mother from long suffering by his side. So I appreciate that they were both able to join me here tonight as well, and thank you for the chance to have this forum.
Bill Beardsley.
Thank you. And thank you to the Chamber and to Eastern Maine Community College for this opportunity. I am Bill Beardsley, and I know Maine's challenges. I know its potential. I've been a successful president at Housing University for 23 years, and I aspire to be a successful governor for the state of Maine. I know finance. I've chaired the Finance Authority of Maine and directed Alaska's Division of Finance and Economics. I know energy. I've been a vice president at Bangor Hydro, and I was the director of the Division of Energy and Power Development for the state of Alaska. I know natural resources. My doctoral dissertation from Johns Hopkins focused on resolving conflicts in multiple use natural resource management here in the state of Maine, an issue that is very dear to my heart and critical to everything else. I also served as director of Alaska's Office of Forest Products. I have been involved with the governor of Vermont and in all my careers in the field of economic development. That's what I bring to the table. I've already made tough decisions on budgets. I can make them again, but I've always done them with compassion towards my colleagues that I work with. I have a proven track record. I have experience, and I aspire to truly serve the state of Maine. That's why I'm running. I'm running because for 23 years, I have helped prepare Maine students for professional careers, and I would now like to make sure that those career opportunities are here in Maine. Thank you.
Matt Jacobson.
Thank you. And thanks so much for coming. I think, and we say this a lot, but one of the most humbling things I can imagine is having people come out at night to come hear us talk, and I appreciate you taking the time to do it. So thank you for coming and having the event. This campaign for me has been remarkable for a number of reasons, but not the least of which are the people I've gotten to meet. I was over in Brewer a few weeks back, and I met a man with a World War II veteran's hat on. I asked him where he served, and he said he was an MP in the war, and that his last assignment, he guarded the prisoners at the Nuremberg trials. I met a man in Kennebunk who had served in Korea during the war, and I asked him where, and he said Chosin Reservoir. Of the 250 men in his company, only 5 came back that weren't killed or wounded. And it occurred to me, as I was driving away from both of those meetings, that in 25 or 30 years, our kids are going to look at us in the same way, because we are going to accomplish great things. We are going to turn Maine into a place of opportunity, a place where our kids can stay and pursue their dreams, a place where hard work and personal responsibility pay off, a place where our parents don't have to flee high taxes. And I have a plan to take us there. We need to do 3 things. We need to focus on reducing the costs of those people that create opportunity. We need to make sure that our regulatory system is predictable and reasonable. And we need to make sure that our education system produces a world-class workforce. We focus on those things. We create opportunity, and we do what our responsibility to do, and that is to leave it better than we found it. I'm so happy you're here tonight, and I can't wait to hear your questions. Thanks.
Paul LePage.
Thank you. Thank you to the Chamber of Commerce, and thank you all for being out tonight. I think this evening is an evening where we try to differentiate each other as candidates. And I would like to say I'm the only candidate that's running this year for governor that actually leads a Maine government. As the mayor of Waterville, we have lowered our taxes 5 out of the last 6 years. In 5 consecutive years, we've built our fund balance from $1 million to $10 million. And last November, we were upgraded in our credit from Standard & Poor's from an A- to an A+. In addition to that, I'm also the only candidate for governor that is currently running a major Maine business. We have created jobs in the last decade, and at this point, Martin's, as its senior executive, we have 1,000 people working for us. In addition to that, I think I bring to the table a life story that is unusual in as much as I was homeless at 11 and had to work my way through high school, college, and was successful in my business career. And I hope that my background allows our kids to see that you can make it. In addition, like all the other candidates, I look forward to the questions tonight, answering our plans for the future of Maine, and also the fact that I have been elected and re-elected in one of the most democratic strongholds, the hometown of George Mitchell. Thank you.
Peter Mills.
Well, look, I too want to share in thanking you for turning out. It is a humbling experience, and it's particularly encouraging to see in this audience 2 of my personal heroes, Habib Dagher for all that he's done with economic and engineering development at the University of Maine, and Reverend Bob Carlson for the innovations in healthcare and delivery of health systems. These are 2 people that I look to for constant advice about how to scale up what they do and make it something of a more statewide phenomenon. You're going to hear some common themes tonight because we've been together on the trail and we hear the same, each of us hears the same thing over and over. You're going to hear a lot of promises about jobs, which is the major source of anxiety right now in America, let alone in Maine, about taxes and they're being too high and prohibiting the development of business, welfare, human services, debt, education issues, energy, health care, the burdens of regulation. You're going to hear very similar themes enunciated by most of us Republicans who are up here on the podium today. What I bring to this, however, is 16 years of having been on the front lines of fighting these very battles. I had a great deal to do with completely overhauling Maine's dreadful unemployment compensation system back in 1999. I have on numerous occasions stopped this governor, our present governor, from borrowing us practically into oblivion. I led the Don't Mortgage Me campaign against the $447 million he tried to borrow back in 2005. And we kept the state on more or less of an even keel with that campaign. I've designed a portable pension system for state employees and teachers that I would like to see implemented. And just last week, the governor signed my fund of funds bill to attract venture capital here. So in me, you know what you've got. You've got somebody with a track record, somebody who understands something about government as well as the private sector. I think it's time to put a Republican into the Blaine House, and I'm putting myself forward for that posture. Thank you.
Les Otten.
Good evening, and I too want to thank you for coming. Maine's lost 32,000 jobs in the last 17 months. The top priority of my administration will be to create jobs in the private sector. I have 6 initiatives that I think are key to creating jobs in the state of Maine. The first is that we have to overhaul our tax system. Our taxes for capital gains and inheritance drive money out of the state of Maine and make it impossible to find the needed dollars to start businesses. We need welfare reform. The state of Maine cannot be looked at as a sanctuary state. We must turn welfare into workfare, and when people think of Maine from outside of Maine, they need to think of Maine as a state that they're going to come to work. We need to lower our insurance costs. A 30-year-old male in Maine pays $756 for exactly the same policy that 30-year-old male in New Hampshire pays $222. That's unacceptable, and that's one of the main reasons why jobs aren't coming to Maine. We need to cut spending and get regulatory reform in place in Maine. Maine is in the way. Maine needs to pave the way. And we ought to be energy independent. 80% of our energy comes from number 2 oil. No one believes that that's the fuel of the future. We need LNG. We need wind, we need solar, we need Canadian power. We need to do it before it's too late and before we're out of business. And finally, we need to educate our kids for the jobs of tomorrow. We need to take advantage of our fine university systems and high schools and make sure that our kids are getting the educations that they're going to need to stay here in Maine so that our kids are not our number 1 export. We need to reboot Augusta. The 6 things that I'm talking about don't cost me the need to put my hand in your wallet. These are things that we can do in Maine without taxing you. We need a state government that works for you, that's the right size for Maine, that's accountable, and that gets us back to creating jobs. That's my vision. That will be my leadership mantra. I look forward to working for you. Thank you.
Thank you for your introductory remarks. We'd like to start now with some questions, and I will tell you that we'll begin with Mr. Abbott on the very end and work our way down. Would you favor the use of state funds to help finance a new convention center or arena for the city of Bangor or other communities that can demonstrate an economic and community benefit for such a facility?
I would. I think it's critically important that we have a new Bangor arena. The Bangor Auditorium has served us very well for many years, many years. And it's just time for an upgrade, and that we're going to need a new facility there. That's not important just for Bangor. That's important for all of northern and eastern Maine. The amount of commerce that goes through that facility, the amount of entertainment that goes on in that facility, it is just critical to northern and eastern Maine that we have a new facility. I don't think the state funding should be the primary driver behind it, but I think state funding could be a component to get that completed.
Mr. Beardsley?
I believe we ought to not use our bonding issues. We have tremendous needs for roads and bridges and schools. I think we need to be very, very careful and restrictive on how we use our bonds till we get our financials straightened out. I think if the state will take money out of the operating budget to support something like this, I would support it. But in general, I don't think at this point the state can afford spending a considerable amount of money with any metropolitan area on projects such as that.
Mr. Jacobson?
You know, I agree with Steve in terms of the need, but I think it's really interesting to look at what's happened in other cities and other places. Portland, for example, had a big fight just this last fall about the hockey team that almost left, the Pirates. And the owner of the Pirates wanted to buy the facility and rehab it, and we wouldn't sell it to him. I think there are alternative ways. I think that there are exciting ways for the private sector to get involved in. Certainly we can incent that activity, but I think we need to think differently. Rather than run to the problem with tax money, let's see if we can't find some private companies that might want to put up an arena. Let's figure out what the deal needs to look like before we go at building arenas again.
Mr. LePage?
I believe there's a need for it, but I also believe that I would bring to Augusta the same model we use in Martin's. We do not build or open a new store until we know we have the money. And I don't think that in the current state of affairs in the state of Maine, with $11.6 billion debt, that it is wise to go building arenas when we get complaints every day about losing wheels on our cars because the potholes are so big. So I think I would go along with Bill. I think a priority is roads, bridges, and the state's basic infrastructure before I build new arenas.
Mr. Mills?
With taxpayer dollars.
I'm sorry, excuse me. I'll let you finish that.
That's fine.
Mr.
I'll
Mills?
remember that.
I wouldn't rule out using some state funds for development purposes if it were clear that the city, the county, that private entities, these things are done with many moving parts and with composite funding. And if you had all of the other pieces in place, it seems to me reasonable for the state to chip in. One of the proposals that was put forth several years ago, I think, was for a local options sales tax within the confines of Bangor, the proceeds of which would be devoted or dedicated to such a purpose. I'm trying to remember how I voted in the issue. I think I supported it. Your senator was sitting in front of me, and I'm pretty sure I had encouragement from him. But there are many ways of going at it, and the state certainly can play a role in those things.
Mr. Otten?
I think the state can play a role, but I don't think the state can afford to stand behind the construction of an arena like that at this point in time. I think it's also important to understand that we can't borrow our way to prosperity. We really have to look at the economic value of the institutions that we're looking at. And we're at a point in time, and it may change in 10 years, but we've been in a technical recession for 36 months. We've lost 32,000 jobs. We're going backwards, and right now state government needs to stop spending money, and we need to do a little bit more with what we have before we start building new things.
Our next question, we know that most or all of you would like to see changes in the federal health care reform legislation, and we'll refrain from discussing that in particular, but instead assume for a minute that the legislation is not changed. What can the state of Maine do to make health care work better under the new law? We'll start with Mr. Beardsley.
First, we have 110,000 government employees. Most of them don't have any options. Every government employee should have a choice of several options, including medical savings accounts. Second of all, I think obviously we need to get rid of Derigo, which is expensive. In the private sector, we would have cut it loose long before. I find the whole process of certificate of need seems to be more focused on constraint of trade and limits the dispersion of health services into rural areas, and I think that needs a serious overhaul. I think we need to, as they do in places like Idaho, that pharmacists can give prescriptions under certain areas. I think what you need to really do is spread out our ability to give primary care to nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and others. So I think there's a range, but mostly it's in reintroducing competition the way we did with workers' comp to bring costs down.
Mr. LePage? Excuse me, Mr. Jacobson.
Okay. You want to go?
I'm just trying to keep you on your toes.
Yes, ma'am. You got my attention.
Thank you.
How do we reduce the cost of health care in Maine under this regime and under the old one? There's 2 or 3 things we need to do. Maine has mandates. We have the most mandates of any state in the country, meaning that if you buy an insurance policy in Maine, the state decides what you have to be covered for. We don't do that with car insurance. I suspect you and I have different car insurance companies and different collision and deductible and all the rest. We're trusted to make those choices, but not on health care. Let me tell you how silly it is. My son goes to Cathedral School in Portland. He's a spirited lad, and the nuns are good for him. The nuns that teach him are forced to carry maternity coverage. Why? Because every policy in Maine has to have that. We got to reduce those mandates. We got to fix Maine Care. And when I get more time, next time maybe we talk a little bit about Maine Care and why that costs you more money for your health insurance.
Mr. LePage.
First of all, Derigo has to go. I mean, it was a great experiment. I commend the governor for at least trying something. But after a couple of years when we saw it was failing, he should have pulled the plug. It's on life support now, and I would pull the plug. I believe community rating is bad for the state of Maine. I think, as Les said earlier in his opening, that we really need to encourage our youth to get health insurance. And you don't with the current rate structure that we have in the state of Maine. I mean, if you all remember back when you were 18, you all felt immortal, you all felt that you didn't need insurance and you never get sick. And that's how they feel today. And it's unaffordable, so we need to work on making health insurance affordable. The other thing is we need to go over state lines. We need to be able to buy state lines, and we need to be able to buy a la carte. I think Matt's absolutely correct. Nuns do not need maternity insurance. And if they do, they're probably going to leave the order anyways. Thank you.
Mr. Mills.
Maine's healthcare costs have been very high and trending higher since 1991 when we passed both guaranteed issue and very rigid community rating bands. Interestingly enough, the federal law does much the same thing to the whole rest of the country. So we just have to wait for them to be as expensive as we are, and we won't be at a disadvantage any longer. That's tongue-in-cheek. 17% of the gross national product of America and about 22% of Maine's gross state product goes for health care. The rest of the world is somehow able to do it for 9 or 10%, and they cover everybody. This is the same thing, really, as a 7 or 8% sales tax on every single good and service that we produce in America. The biggest single challenge our governor will have next year will be to bring health care costs under control, because the bill in Congress didn't do it. It's going to be up to the states to do it, and Maine should lead the way on it.
Mr. Otten.
Clearly, what was done in Washington is not going to benefit Maine. The number one thing that will benefit Maine will be competition. In New Hampshire, 13 companies are writing insurance, and in Maine, 1 is writing insurance. Transparency, being able to see what your costs are, and competition are key to driving down health costs. And we need a high-risk pool. In New Hampshire, they've replaced Dirigo with a high-risk pool that 3,400 people take part in, and as again I told you, the average 30-year-old is saving about $6,000. But most importantly, at the top of everyone's list, and it should have been at the top of Obama's list as well, we need to be talking about wellness. 60 to 70% of all our health care costs in America are avoidable, and there's not one word of it in the federal legislation, and there hasn't been talk of it in Maine, and we can get there in Maine. We can be healthier, and that can be the key to driving down costs in Maine.
As Republicans, all of you either favor a reduction in... I'm sorry, excuse me. I should let you answer the questions. Why don't we go through? Mr. Abbott, go right ahead.
First of all, Maine should join and/or lead the effort to repeal and replace the current federal law. Second of all, Maine should eliminate Dirigo. Third of all, we should take our Dirigo population and our Maine care population and put them into a managed care situation. That's how you could control costs. And if we partnered with our hospitals and our system providers, I think that we could help deliver more efficient care as well as we did that. I agree with Les that we need a high-risk pool. We need to be able to purchase insurance across state lines. And it's also important that we let small businesses pool together more easily to buy insurance. That helps you get larger numbers, and that's what we did with workers' comp. It worked very successfully, and I think it would help with health insurance as well.
Our third question of the evening. As Republicans, all of you either favor a reduction in or holding the line with regard to taxes as a means for encouraging economic development. We don't really want to focus on that part right now. Instead, let's talk about the role that public investment plays in economic development. Right now, you're seated in a community college that is part of a major success story over the past decade. Would you favor further investment of taxpayer dollars to help the community college system grow? And what other public investments might be vital to economic growth in your minds? We'll start with Mr. Jacobson.
It's a great question. The way you put it is, I think, backwards. We need to focus on what the customers, what the companies need, and then decide what investments we need to make. Certainly, we have to have a world-class workforce. And I think the community college system has done a much better job than the university system has at connecting the product with our emerging, our existing businesses. But we need to focus on the businesses and what they need, and then we make investments based on their needs, not based on what we think we want, and see if that fits a customer. And that's kind of how we've done economic development in Maine. We find out when the fire, when the plant closes, and then we go to the business and see, what we can do to put the people on some sort of health insurance, some sort of unemployment insurance. We ought to look very focused at the needs of our potential customers and worry about investment after we define what they want.
Mr. LePage?
Yeah, I do favor higher education, and I'm a big fan of the community college and the university system. And matter of fact, at Martin's we've established a major fund for the community college students in the state of Maine. However, I'll go back and say that before you can invest further into the infrastructure university system, we've got to make sure that we get our fiscal house in order. And right now, I don't believe that it is wise to further increase the debt on Maine people for the purpose of expanding the state. It's just unrealistic to think that we can become prosperous by more debt.
Mr. Mills?
At a macro level, state economics are pretty simple. We have two major pillars of cost. We have the human services component, which includes Medicaid, the care of dependent populations, and then we have education, K through 12, and the higher education components. They are roughly equal, and the challenge, frankly, is how do you save money, reduce costs in the human services arena so that you can afford to spend more on education and things which spell growth and mark progress for our future. So I think that's the governor's big challenge. How do you gain efficiencies in the delivery of required human services while in order to spring forth the money, the resources you need for things that spell growth for us. The community colleges have done a very good job of managing their market, and there's a lot of confidence in them. The university is undergoing turmoil right now, and I think they'll come through it well.
Mr. Otten?
Well, I think the most important thing that we can do is recognize that our university system needs to start teaching our kids the jobs of the future, not the jobs of the past. And I think we have to look around at some of the things that we're doing well and do more of them, and the things that we're not doing as well and cut it back. I'll give you two examples. I see Habib Deeger here tonight. The Wood Lab at the University of Maine in Orono is probably the most advanced in the world. Maine has some of the best slow-growing fiber in the world, and there's more fiber growing in Maine there has been in 100 years. We need to redouble and maybe triple our efforts in the use of wood fiber. At the same time, at the University of Southern Maine, we graduate about 200 kids a year from the state of Maine in sports marketing. Over a 10-year period of time, that's 2,000 sports marketing degrees. There aren't 2,000 sports marketing jobs in Maine. So it's priorities, and let's be intelligent about those priorities, and I think we can do a lot more with what we're working with.
Mr. Abbott?
It's critically important that we look at our community college and our state university system and find opportunities to save money there, because those two entities are going to be the core of our economic development in the future. I support public investment in research and development. I think that's the only way we can compete in Maine, and the only way we can compete in America is if we continue to lead the world in research and development. I also support investment in infrastructure, and I think research and development, our higher education, and our infrastructure are going to be the keys to our economic future. I will tell you that in 1975, the state of Maine used to spend 18% of its general fund money on higher education. We now spend 9%. We can't compete with the Chinese like that. We've got to be able to innovate if we're going to win.
Mr. Beardsley, go ahead.
The University of Maine's a land-grant university, and it ought to be independent of all other universities, much like the University of Vermont. I don't believe there should be two public campuses in any metropolitan area. I would close down the campus over at the airport. I would take the funds from that, build an endowment for scholarships. I'd move everybody onto a single campus, which would be Eastern Maine Community College. We have a propensity in Maine to do fields of dreams, build all the social infrastructure, and they'll come. I think what you do is you go to the industry the way they do in Ireland, find out specifically what it is, and then you target your state investments to that particular industry, such as with Chimbro, it would be welding. We should be asking Domtar what it is they need and find out with Washington County Community College. It should be very, very targeted. We don't have enough money to continue this social overhead capital approach versus direct productive activity strategy for Maine.
We have time for one more question before we take a quick break, and we'll start with Mr. LePage. If voters approve the Oxford County Casino referendum proposal, would you favor amending that law to allow for table games at Hollywood Slots and/or a tribal casino in eastern Maine?
That's a very good question, and I think that before you can answer that question, you got to decide what Maine is going to be. And I do not favor tourism as the #1 industry in the state of Maine. I think that we could do better. We need to concentrate on paper, farms, and fishing. That's the backbone of the state of Maine. I personally have never voted in favor of a casino. If the state of Maine decides and its priority is that Maine has to become, its #1 industry will be tourism, then I don't see how you can have tourism in the state of Maine without casinos. Quite frankly, the only gambling I've ever done in my life is I get out of bed in the morning and I take my chances in the world. So gambling is not a big priority in my lifetime. But I don't see any problem with gambling because I do believe in a free market system.
Mr. Mills?
My answer is no.
Mr. Otten?
My answer is yes. Since I have another 50 seconds, I'll use them. 1 out of every $5 that moves through the state of Maine is tourism related. And 1 out of every 6 jobs in the state of Maine is related to the tourist industry. Now, the tourist industry encompasses everything from hunting and fishing to casino gambling. I believe that we need a good law for casinos, that if it's properly vetted, if it benefits the people of the state of Maine, then it should happen. But each casino has to be evaluated on its merits, at its location, and whether it is helpful to its community or whether it's a strain on the state of Maine. So each time we vote for a casino, you've got to look at the details because that's where the devil is lying. And there have been good proposals and bad proposals. The Oxford proposal seems to be a good one at this point.
Mr. Abbott?
My answer is yes as well. If the Oxford proposal passes, I think it's only fair that Bangor have the opportunity for expanded table gaming, and it's only fair that the Passamaquoddies have their opportunity as well.
Mr. Beardsley?
No, I would enforce the law, but I personally oppose all gambling.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much for sticking to your times. We are going to take about a minute or two break right now and let you have a breather, take a drink, and we'll be back in just a minute or so.
You're watching the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce Eaton Peabody Gubernatorial Primary Debate for the Republican Party. Through advocacy, leadership, and education, the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce promotes business, sustainability, and strives to enhance our rich quality of life. The Chamber represents 800 members in 21 communities. Check the website, bangorregion.com, for more information about Chamber membership and a list of upcoming seminars that are being held in conjunction with Eastern Maine Development Corporation. Thank you to Page Employment, Seaboard Security, and My Video Productions for producing this program. Now we continue with the debate.
Again, we appreciate all of the candidates here sticking to your time so that we can get in as many questions as possible this evening. So we'll get started again. We're going to begin now with some questions that have been submitted by Chamber members directly. This one is a little long-winded, so hold on for the question at the end. It comes from Eastern Maine Healthcare Systems. In 2009, the Baldacci administration satisfied part of several years of Maine care debt owed to Maine hospitals using federal stimulus funds. But he did not correct the structural problem in reimbursement. In other words, the debt is now climbing at a rate of about $250,000 a day statewide. It now exceeds $285 million for services provided over the past 3 years, and that debt continues to grow with no plan for paying it off. How do you propose to fix this problem going forward if you become governor? We'll begin with Mr. Mills.
I was part of the group that led the fight to get that payment made out of the stimulus funds because the Democrats were quite prepared to spend it on anything else but paying that debt off. This is one of the legacies of our current governor. one of the many debt legacies that he's going to leave the next governor to pay. There isn't any quick answer to that. The bill has to be paid. The Medicaid federal match is either 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, depending on whether you get the stimulus money or not, 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. And it should be paid just as soon as possible. We are converting, however, the hospital payment system to a real-time fee-for-service system so that the system eventually will come clean. I had something to do with that this past year. But he's right about the pileup in obligations that have accrued since 2007.
Mr. Otten.
Well, frankly, we've been writing checks that we haven't been able to cash for over a decade, which is why we have the problem that we have. To get rid of the problem is going to take time. The first step, and I'll be honest with you, I don't understand how hospitals can be businesses and we can expect them to provide services where they give us services today and they get reimbursed 3 years from now at about 60% of what they spent taking care of us. The whole system is broken, and I think we have to re-examine it and do a top-down look at the system. But immediately, we have to start paying current. We have a debt of $285 million, but we can't add to that. We start by living within our means on an immediate basis and making sure that we start being current with our hospital systems currently, and that will alleviate the immediate problem. But the bigger problem is going to take more than the 60 seconds that we have to discuss it.
Mr. Abbott.
We need to work first with our congressional delegation to try to fix the unfair reimbursement rate that Maine has to deal with with our Medicare. And we're getting reimbursed about 84 cents on the dollar, which means people with insurance are paying sometimes up to 133 cents on the dollar for their care. The second thing we have to do, I think, is look at a structural change to the system. I think with our Maine care population, we'd be much better off if we could transition into a fee-per-patient system rather than a fee-per-service patient system. I think that'd be better for the hospitals. You could get them the money up front. They wouldn't get as much money, but they'd get predictable cash flow, and I think we'd get better care for our patients. So I think those are two steps that we could make right off that would help.
Mr. Beardsley.
We should honor our obligations as a state. I think we have to start that way. I think we have to find as rapid, a clear way to pay that off. The same thing's true with our 55% commitment to our schools. We absolutely, if we're going to make those kinds of commitments, we need to be trusted when we do that. I also think that we ought to be looking at standardizing reimbursements so that each institution gets the same level of reimbursement for the same service. And we have differential reimbursements as well as inadequate reimbursements, and it leads to, I guess, what you call social engineering, and it's not being driven by cost factors.
Mr. Jacobson.
I think there's a broader problem here. 240-something thousand Mainers are on Maine Care. 23% of our population. We are trapping these people in generational welfare. We are robbing them of their human dignity. We are stealing the futures from their children. And our problem is the money? Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, we ought to be so ashamed of ourselves that we are trapping generations and hundreds of thousands of Mainers in this system. We need to fix that problem, as well as pay off the hospitals. We ought to be outraged that we are housing these people in this system. It's not okay. It's not okay.
Mr. LePage.
I believe we need to fix our mandates so that we have more Mainers buying private insurance rather than being on Maine Care. I do believe that we need to go, as we go forward, we need to be paid up current. The debt that is accrued for the last 3 years will take some time. And quite frankly, when I said earlier that I would not favor an arena, those are the type of things I believe we need to do first. We need to pay the existing debt that we have on the books before we start doing new things. We need to fix our basic infrastructure. And education is a major factor. You know, and interestingly enough, in education, for instance, in Waterville, we've lowered education costs by about $3 million the last 5 years, and we've given it back to the taxpayer, despite the fact the state is not reimbursing us at the levels they were several years ago.
Chamber member Earl Black of Town and Country Realtors asks this question. The forest products industry has been a key to the Bangor region economy for centuries. What is your plan to preserve what remains of that industry? And once preserved, what must we do to make that sector grow? We'll start with Mr. Otten.
Well, I think the forest products industry is one of our most exciting opportunities going forward. We have more, better, slow-growing fiber than anybody in the world. We have more trees in our forest than we have in a century, and we have the opportunity, if we would change our rules and regulations, to reinvite the paper industry back into the state of Maine. There are 60 large paper machines being built worldwide. None are being built in Maine, mostly because of our rules and regulations and our past history in making paper companies feel uncomfortable. At Domtar, they're passing by the mill with the pulp and sending it to China and then bringing it back into the United States. And that just doesn't make common sense. We can make Brillo pads out of our wood fiber. We can make cellulosic ethanol. We can make wood pellets. We can heat our homes. I chaired a study for the governor that 10% of the state of Maine could heat their homes with modern wood products, and we would create 9,600 jobs. Those opportunities are in front of us. Our forests are our future.
Mr. Abbott.
Our forest products industry is going to be key to the future economic development of Maine. It's especially key for the 2nd District. I strongly support it. I tell people all the time in Augusta, I feel like they've quit on paper, and I think if you quit on paper, you're quitting on Maine. We are going to need a strong forest products industry. We're going to have to innovate and continue to innovate in our forest products industry to develop new products and to find new markets as well. I also think that it is critically important that we understand the role that commercial forestry plays in our tourism industry as well. Maine's economic outdoor future is dependent upon private ownership of the big woods. We've got to preserve private ownership in commercial forestry if our forest products industry and our outdoor recreation industries are going to be successful.
Pleasant River Lumber in Dover Foxcroft, every job they add, it's a multiplier effect in employment of 4 jobs, upstream and downstream in the poorest county east of the Mississippi. Pleasant River has a $200 penalty on every load of lumber it sends out of its mill compared to St. Leonard in New Brunswick. We have this cascading regulatory problem where somebody has set aside 40 acres of prime forest land of mature pine to retire on, to pass on to their family. And it's designated as vernal pools with 7 acres around each pool, and it's being proposed as 50 acres. We are undercapitalized in the forest industry. We're not, you have to invest for a long time there. We're not treating our forest industry right, and yet we have evidence that we can commercially sell quality pulp around the world. Then why can't we attract a $500 million paper machine? That's the question we need to ask and answer.
Mr. Jacobson.
You know, I ran the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railroad headquartered in Auburn, and we used to joke that we were a paper railroad. And I spent an awful lot of time talking to paper mills to understand what products I could give them so they'd ship more on my railroad. If we listen to the paper mills, if we listen to the people that run those mills, the president of NewPage last summer put out about a 10-page booklet on what he needed the state of Maine to do to help him expand his mill in Maine. It was about LNG, it was about workforce, it was about regulatory environment, it was about energy costs. Our governor took the thing at a press conference and ignored it. We didn't do anything that he recommended us that we do. If we don't listen to the people that are running the mills, if we don't listen to the people that are running the small businesses, we will never solve the problems. This is not magic. He told us what he needed. Let's just execute.
Mr. LePage.
I spent 25 years of my career in the forest products industry. I came out of the pulp and paper industry. I remember one year out of 29 plants worldwide, 9 of the plant managers graduated from the University of Maine in Arno. They had a great pulp and paper school. They had a great engineering school. That's pretty much gone away because the paper industry was chased away due to our regulations. We had to compete for capital at corporate offices, and we lost out every year because of the regulations in Maine were unbearable. First thing you do, you reform LERC. LERC needs a major attitude adjustment. Number one, DEP needs a major attitude adjustment. We need to stop being an adversarial to business and become a partner to business. Secondly, land for Maine's future should go back to the private sector.
Mr. Mills.
Well, the woods of Maine are now producing more lumber and timber and pulp than ever. And Maine is a more forested state than it was 100 years ago. And there's a lot going on out there. But I think the future lies in taking our existing paper mills and using some of the research that's coming out of the University of Maine and other sources to turn them into different enterprises. For instance, we right now take black liquor, which is about half what you get out of wood. You get fiber and black liquor, and we're just burning it. Why not take black liquor and turn it into diesel fuel, plastic, set up small refineries associated with the paper and the paper plants so that we extract all of the value that we can get out of our woods. The cogeneration projects to make sure that our paper mills are not relying on standard oil for their energy. And thirdly, the most interesting idea I've heard lately is that these paper mills with gates around them and constant energy would be ideal places for server farms for Google. Thank you.
We'll start with this question at the far end of the table with Mr. Abbott. Chamber member Mary Cathcart of the University of Maine's Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center offers this question. Maine has 15 public colleges and universities and multiple centers for distance education. Given the continuing budget shortfalls, how would you as governor structure higher education to make sure that college is more affordable and increase Maine's number of college degree holders?
I think it's going to be important over the next decade for us to look at the university system and the community college system to see where we can find savings. I think a number of those savings can be found at the administrative level. And we're going to have to look at the systems office and determine what that role should be. I think there's a lot of redundant functions that are done within those campuses. We have to look at the savings that can be found through distance learning. I think the Hutchinson Center that we have in Belfast is a model. We run that center with one administrator, and we put 1,500 students through there a year. There's things that we can do within this system. The savings are not going to be found in bricks and mortar. The savings are going to be found at the administrative level and at the functions, and that's where we've got to focus.
Mr. Beardsley.
As I said before, I think the University of Maine should be a freestanding institution with its own board and the like. I think we've got a challenge, and we found a homogenization of the community college with the state colleges. There are more similarities and differences than in the past. And so when I look down in, I think at Presque Isle, where you've got Northern Maine Community College and University of Maine at Presque Isle, they're on separate campuses, separate presidents. I mean, at Hudson, on our campus, there's the Bangor Theological Seminary, there's the New England School of Communications, there's the offices of the Bangor Symphony. That's where I get this idea that we ought to be converging campuses. I also think we ought to be pricing differently. I think what we have kind of a flat price for everybody, rich and poor alike, more like the University of Vermont system. We ought to have a higher, say, tuition at the, and then discount much more deeply for low-income students.
Mr. Jacobson.
I think we're focused on the wrong problem again. Sorry, but let's focus on the product. Are our kids able to get a job in Maine when they get done with a program in Maine? And if they're not, then let's fix the program so that they are. Les talked about the sports marketing degree. It's a great example. Where are those kids going to go to school? Meanwhile, we don't have a insurance degree. 18,000 people in Maine work in back office insurance. There's no actuarial science degree in Maine. We've got to line up our education system with our businesses and emerging jobs. The other thing that's going to happen to us is distance learning in a real way. I talked to a kid that got the best degree in the world in turf management from Penn State. He lives in Colorado. He's never been to Penn State. He did the whole thing online. If you can get the best degree in the world sitting in your living room in Presque Isle, why are you going to go to UMaine Presque Isle? The point is you're not. And we're going to have to figure out how to compete in that market, not just put more money into our bricks and mortar.
Mr. LePage.
I don't see how we can concentrate on giving a good education to our youth if we can't provide them jobs. And we're not going to provide them sustainable long-term jobs until we get a house in order in Augusta, number one, in the regulatory side and in the government side. We need to bring some common sense to Augusta and some business sense to Augusta. Secondly, I do agree with Bill Beardsley. I think we have a humongous system. In the system, there's an awful lot of overlap, a lot of things that can be done to reduce the system and create more capacity. Virtual education is very viable. It is going around the world. and it's very successful. I really believe that we need to get a house in order before we can set priorities for the future of our kids.
Mr. Mills?
I think perhaps the time has come to consolidate the community college system with the university system. I think that should be very carefully considered. And I think that new board of trustees and the new chancellor, whoever that person is, ought to be challenged with the prospect of reducing the number of duplicative campuses. I agree with Bill Beardsley on that point. That's well taken. He's an expert at consolidating campuses, and he's done very well at it. And maybe we should put him in charge of it.
I don't think he wants that job.
It's we don't run it like a business, but on the other hand, every time a chancellor has attempted to run the university like a business, the legislature, in its wisdom, intervenes and fouls up the program. But I think we need to rethink. We have more campuses than the University of California. That doesn't make a lot of sense for Maine.
Mr. Otten?
60 seconds is honestly not enough time to spend on the complications of this question. Selma Botman, who's president of the University of Southern Maine, said to me in an interview that she granted me that if she had to cut any more costs, what she'd like to do is turn Lewiston into something else and turn Gorham into something else and concentrate all of her efforts on one campus where she felt she could do a good job. But that may be the answer for her school, but not for Presque Isle or Fort Kent. Let's make sure we don't make the same mistake that we made with K through 12 consolidation, where one size fits all. Campobello in Canada and Lubec in the United States. Lubec is going to lose their high school because they can't coordinate, they can't consolidate with Canada. We need individual solutions that work in individual communities, and there is not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to such a complicated question.
This next question will start with Mr. Beardsley. Chamber member Carrie Weston of Southern Western Marketing and Communications asks, given the importance of growing this economy, what plans do you have, if any, for restructuring the Department of Economic and Community Development?
I would eliminate it. I think there's some functions that could go over to John Doerr in the Department of Labor. I have a hard time pointing to anything that they've done for anybody that I know. I think the governor should be the chief economic development officer of the state. I think the Finance Authority of Maine, MELA, the Maine Housing Authority, the MAHIFA should be consolidated and have a much higher loan guarantee basis, so you've really got a tremendous force of economic power. Other candidates have proposed other ways to do it, but I think that consolidating the existing system. So I feel that that is one of the departments, along with the State Planning Office. Again, it doesn't mean they aren't doing some things of relevance, but they can be outsourced, let's say, to the Maine Development Foundation or something. So, but I think that's minor compared to what you've got to do in the areas of education and health and human services.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yeah, there's only three ways to create jobs. You either bring a new company here, you help an existing business expand, or you help an early stage company get funding and incubate. That's what we do at Main & Company. And Main & Company is the best, when they started, was a best practices model that states use, a public-private partnership, where the state funds and the private sector, who's good at sales and marketing and understands about finance and understands what companies need, administers the program. Florida does it very well, the best in the country. Utah does it very well. South Carolina does it very well. I would outsource it and bring to fruition what the King administration started and we derailed with this administration, is that kind of a public-private partnership where the private sector are the people that are driving the train and the public sector are holding them accountable and helping to fund it.
Mr. LePage?
I agree with Matt. I think it's a private-public partnership. I certainly would shrink that department. I agree with Bill as well that they've not done very well, and I think that different parts of the state have different needs, and I think that the people from different parts of the state have a much better feel for what is needed in their communities than someone sitting in Augusta who's a buddy from the governor who went to high school with him. I think that's absurd and it's despicable. Quite frankly, I think the two biggest areas, though, you need to shrink state government and you need to reform the regulatory system from a control system to an oversight system. And I'll tell you, you do that, you're going to find a lot of companies want to come to Maine. We just need to stabilize and fix our house.
Mr. Mills?
Well, the Department of Economic and Community Development is one of the tiniest in state government, and so whatever you do with it, you're not going to save or lose a whole lot of money. It does contain within it the Bureau of Tourism, which has responsibility for spending about $8 million a year in tourism promotion, which no one here, I think, would cut out. And in fact, if the bill that's on the ballot for June 8th is sustained, there will be something like $12 million for tourism promotion flowing through that bureau. A lot of states take their economic development function and they turn it over to the Department of Labor and have something called the Department of Commerce or Commerce and Labor. And when you think about it, the Labor Department is really doing about the same thing, or has the same goal in mind as a Department of Commerce or Economic Development. I would agree. I would put public money back into Main and Company. I think that should be restored as a public-private partnership.
Mr. Otten?
I think it's been fairly well said. We have a multiple number of ABC agencies that are essentially all trying to do the same thing, that lack coordination at the senior level of management, which is in the governor's office. I think it is the governor's responsibility to rein that all in one place, because if it is not going to be centralized and not going to be coordinated, we're going to all be running over each other. And there's 6 different agencies you can go to look for job help and money and help your business. But let's take a look at something that I think is exceedingly important to us here in the state of Maine. We're about to lose 7,000 jobs to Collier County in Florida because Jackson Labs is going to build their new facility there instead of Maine. While we've been sleeping, messing around with all of our tiny little agencies and fighting for fiefdoms, we let the big ones slip away. And that's something that we cannot tolerate. We've got to go after those 7,000 jobs and try to figure out how to bring them back to Maine.
Mr. Abbott?
I think it is an important function, and it is something that's crying out for leadership from the governor's office. There's a lot of lessons we can learn. Look at the work we've done quite a bit at the local level. I mean, I look at the work they've done in Brewer. I look at the work that we've done at Eastern Maine. I think there's some opportunities there, but it does require leadership from the governor, and it also requires a more regional, coordinated approach to economic development.
Chamber member Lewis Payne of Merrill Bank points out that the last Republican nominee for governor got some negative press when it came to his personal finances. His question is, what are your credit scores? We'll start with Mr. Jacobson.
See, I way outpunted my coverage when I got married. My wife is an emergency room physician, so I'm all set there.
Mr. LePage?
I don't believe in debt, and I don't have debt.
How's your credit?
Pay cash.
Mr. Mills?
Pay cash.
I'm another one who likes to live off his spouse if I can, and our credit is reported to be very good, and I don't know the number. It's 7 or I don't even know what the numbers mean, but I think it's somewhere between 700 and 800. But I need to pick up on something that was just said because it's a grotesque fabrication. The state of Maine is not sending 7,000 jobs down to Florida. Jackson Labs has completely refuted that. They're sending down something between 0 and 200 jobs, and they're being paid $260 million by, or they think they are, by the state of Florida to go do that. And frankly, the state of Maine couldn't possibly have competed for that facility down there. I mean, I'm just offended that somebody would say there were 7,000 jobs at stake in that transaction. That's just being done for political reasons, Mr. Otten.
Mr. Otten, we'll give you 30 seconds to respond to that response.
You've been told that that's not true by Jackson Labs.
I have been told that Jackson Labs is intending on moving 200 jobs to Florida that will create a total of 7,000 jobs on their campus. They're receiving $130 million from Collier County. There was never a discussion in the state of Maine, and frankly, I'm appalled that you challenged me, but that's your right. I think the facts will speak for themselves.
I think we have an obligation to the public to challenge you when you produce falsehoods in your campaign literature.
Mr. Otten, did you finish your response?
I'm afraid that if I finish my response, I will elicit another angry response from Mr. Mills. I asked and have talked to the people at Jackson Labs. They would like the opportunity to discuss their situation in the state of Maine. It is not a foregone conclusion that they are going to Florida. To understand what they're doing is they are going to genetically engineer mice that could be used by every drug company in America that would locate around their campus to specifically identify how drugs work in different individuals. The Brookings report that was prepared for the state of Maine calls for exactly that kind of cluster development to occur in Maine. I stand by my statement, and I think we have an opportunity to work with Jackson Labs to create more jobs in Maine.
Now we'll ask you about your credit score.
Well, I'm single, I'm best friends with my ex-wife, and my payments are up to date.
At the end of the table, Mr. Abbott.
I am married and have 2 children, a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. We live in a nice house in Portland that has a mortgage, and I have no idea what our credit score is. I can tell you that I am currently unemployed and seeking a job. So.
Mr. Beardsley.
Steve. No, I don't know of any credit score. We have no debt, and I've got 3 kids, 2 living in Maine, all of whom have good jobs. And if things get rough, I'm going to certainly turn on them.
I think I went first on that.
You did. All right. We're going to talk taxes now, and we'll start with Mr. LePage in this. Government here in Maine gets its money from 3 main sources: the state income tax, the sales tax, and local property taxes. Among those, where should our tax relief efforts be targeted?
Property taxes. I believe property taxes in the state of Maine since the year 2000 have grown 68%. And the reason they're growing so fast is the state of Maine tries to be everything to everybody. They've grown a government that is not sustainable based on the income levels of Maine people. We need to get some relief. LD1 was intended to provide relief. I know of one community that provided the relief to its taxpayers because we lowered our taxes 13%, and LD1 was a major factor. But many communities did not. But the taxpayers of Maine cannot afford the rate in which the property taxes are climbing. And the next one is, I think, the most regressive other tax in the state of Maine is the sales tax.
Mr. Mills?
It's the capital gains tax. We are, for years, have been charging 8.5% on capital gains. Everybody that looks to invest venture capital in Maine or to open up a new facility of any kind has that burden when they're looking at the Excel spreadsheet of looking at an 8.5% black mark penalty that runs across the top of the form. So if you can reduce that to 6 or 6.5%, it makes you more competitive with Massachusetts and other New England states. To me, the key to economic development is to get away from all of these stupid little programs that we have that save a little bit of money here and there for people making new investments but don't do anything for old line businesses like Snow and Neely. Remember when they went out? They said all we ever did wrong was to pay all of our taxes for 120 years or something before we finally got closed. And we don't do anything for our existing businesses, but reducing the top rate of the income tax and the capital gains rate would do exactly that and would restore some measure of economic development here.
Mr. Otten?
We're the highest taxed people in America based on our income when you look at the inheritance tax and the capital gains tax, and I agree completely with what Peter said about capital gains tax. It needs to be reduced, and we need to reduce that because it drives capital out of the state. But we're in a situation that it's kind of like tax du jour, and no matter where you go in the state of Maine and what business you're in, some people are affected by the lodging and meals tax, and that's the worst tax for them. Others by the property tax. Others by income, others by capital gains tax, and others by inheritance tax. We now have to pay money to go fish in the ocean. I mean, that's nothing more than another tax. When I came to Maine 38 years ago, and I started at Sunday River with 4 employees, which grew to 1,200, people used to talk about Taxachusetts. Well, now it's just the opposite. If I was in Massachusetts, I'd pay less taxes than I was in Maine. And that's what we have to change. That's our challenge. To get there, we need to create new jobs.
Mr. Abbott?
The taxes that people have identified are a real deterrent to job creation and job growth. We have another tax that's a problem in Maine, and that is our estate tax. And being so out of line with the federal, it's driving Mainers to become residents of Florida. We have so many people who live in Maine who would rather be Maine citizens, but instead they're changing their residency by living 6 months and a day in Florida. If we had a lower tax rate for them, some kind of compromise rate for Mainers who have spent their lives here, would get a little more revenue from the taxes that they'd pay, but would also get back their charitable giving and would get back the contributions that they make to the communities. We've got to stop driving our seniors to Florida and let them stay here where they want to be.
Mr. Beardsley?
We should focus on tax relief, not tax reform. We get sidetracked and we negotiate. We need to lower our taxes. But I will use one example. In Ireland, when they cut the corporate income tax from 40 to 11%, within 3 years, state revenue mushroomed. It went up. Our taxes are above the national average. Our family income's only 80% of the national average. In 3 of the counties surrounding Penobscot County, it's only 60% of the national average. Some of that's sales tax, some of it's income tax, some of it's corporate. I think we have to be very egalitarian. I just say we need to bring them all down, and that's where our focus has got to be.
Mr. Jacobson?
We need to reduce taxes on the people that create opportunity. This approach to, we'll take that tax or this tax, we have to focus on creating opportunity. And the reason we have to is because we can't cut our way to prosperity. We can't tax our way to prosperity. The only way out of this problem is to grow out of it. If we're going to create opportunity for our kids, if we're going to fulfill that American destiny that every generation in our history has fulfilled, leaving it better for their kids, then we have to grow. There's only 3 ways to grow. And so those companies from away, sorry, but we have to incent them and compete in that world when they create 400 and 500 jobs, like the companies we brought to Belfast and Athena Health and Boston Financial and some of the others. They require a tax incentive to compete in the world. Our businesses here, how do we keep them here? What are the taxes that affect them? Again, we've got some answers from our paper mills. They told us what they need. Early stage companies, yeah, they need capital gains tax cuts and they need seeds tax credit cuts. But we need to do it specifically to attract jobs and opportunity to our state so that we can grow this economy. That's how we get out of this mess.
I think we have time to fit in 2 more questions here. We'll start with Mr. Mills on this one. Would you, as governor, sign a budget that reduces local aid for education if that's what it took to balance the budget and avoid a tax hike?
I think I've already voted for such a budget, so it would be hard for me to deny that I would sign one. We're in a crisis that is very hard to explain in 60 minutes, let alone 60 seconds. But we are spending a lot of money on K through 12 education in our state. We're about $2,000 per student above the national average, yet our teachers are not paid all that well. Part of the reason is that we have top-heavy administrations. We designate a lot of kids onto special ed, more so than almost any other state. We have some serious efficiency problems in K through 12. The state does not hire and fire teachers. That's done at the local level by school boards. And so when you have a crisis at the state level, it is inevitable. I'm sorry, but it's inevitable that some part of that crisis will descend into local government. And I have a plan at my website about how to deal with the K-12 issues. I'd be glad to explain it later.
Mr. Otten?
I do believe that I'm going to be forced to cut the amount of money that goes back to local communities. I also believe that the governor in his budget sets policy, and part of the responsibility is going to give back local control so that local communities can build charter schools, so that we can gain access to the $75 million of Race to the Top that's provided by the federal government that's been out there for a year that we haven't touched. We have to understand that the most altruistic people in the state of Maine are our teachers, and they are the most important people for our future. They need to be properly rewarded. But they also can't expect to be tenured for life and have our administrators handcuffed so they can't put the best people in the classrooms. And there can be a combination of decreased spending with improved education. If you'll look at what's been done in other states, and if we copy some good ideas, we can improve and we don't have to overspend.
Mr. Abbott?
Yes, I would, and I strongly support K through 12 education. I strongly support higher ed. But the fact is, over the past 30 years, we've increased our spending on K through 12 education 461%, and during that same period of time, we've decreased our student population 16%. There's got to be efficiencies out there. There's got to be ways we can save money administratively. We've got to innovate, and we've got to be more efficient.
Mr. Beardsley?
Yeah, the problem is not small rural schools. I mean, the smallest school is a home school, and they're doing all kinds of creative, innovative things. We need to be creative in all our schools. Second of all, we have faculty-student ratios that are far below the average of rural states across the country. We need to lower it down. Why we're higher than Idaho and Montana and Utah is an entirely different issue. It's because we have bureaucracy. We've got main learning results that takes faculty out of the classroom for hours at a time. We give subsidies to special ed so that the schools have an incentive to put more and more kids into special ed to get more state money. It's being addressed, but it's that kind of thing that we got to bring it back down. Those are the kinds of steps. I think we need to get rid of tenure for faculty, and I think we have to have merit increases so we really create what we call a professional environment out there. So I believe by doing those things, you can ratchet down their expenses along with the state's support.
Mr. Jacobson?
I think we're measuring the wrong thing here. We measure money. How much money do we spend on a school? The measure ought to be, are the students going through, and when they get done with the program, can they get a job? 25% of the kids in Maine drop out of high school. Only 25% get a 1, 2, or 4-year degree within 6 years of graduating from high school. That's not good enough. I recruit companies for a living, and never once has anybody told me they want an ignorant workforce. We have got to measure performance. We've got to make sure our kids can get jobs. We are failing our children right now, and to focus on money when the ship is sinking is absolutely the wrong priority. We got to fix the schools. We got our kids ready to compete. That ought to be our focus. There is an organization on the planet that is at once inefficient and excellent. Let's measure excellence, and we will get the efficiency.
Mr. LePage?
I believe we are number 5 in the country in spending K through 12, and we're in the bottom in results. We've gotten to a system where we're teaching for assessment exams, where teachers take a day off to go for a retreat, where we're stealing classroom time. We need to have a commissioner of education in the state of Maine that has a one priority, and that priority is the biggest asset the state of Maine has, and that's the kids in our schools, and not for a person's individual career. We've been lacking that for 8 years. The other thing we can do, folks, you come down to Waterville and take a look at what happened the last 5 years in our school system. We've been taking money out, but the performance are going up. We start with some of the poorest kids in the state in our education system. By the time they reach 12th grade, we've surpassed everyone in the local area. You can do more with less. It's not about money, it's about wanting to get the job done and the best job possible. Our kids.
Our final question this evening will start with Mr. Otten. The state just committed to spending millions on the purchase of rail lines in Aroostook County in order to preserve them. Was this a smart investment, and as governor, would you support similar investments in our rail capacity?
Matt, sorry I got this one first. We're putting money into a private enterprise that has failed numerous times in the last decade. There are other opportunities for us to move freight in Aroostook County. What we should be doing is trying to figure out how to get LNG behind the fence in Aroostook County so we can get 600 more jobs growing potatoes and 600 more jobs processing them. Bonding our way to the future and buying assets that are failing is not a good direction for the state to go in.
Mr. Abbott?
I support saving that Aroostook County rail line, and I think it's critically important to the economic future of Aroostook County. I also think it's critically important to the economic future of northern and eastern Maine. We've got 22 employers that use that line. We've got Louisiana Pacific that's right on the line. We'll lose them immediately if we lose that line. If that steel goes out of there, we're never going to get it back. And I just think no matter how it's done, there should be a way to save that line. I think it could very well involve a state takeover and a lease back, then eventually a sale. But if we lose that line, it is going to be an economic disaster for Aroostook County and ultimately an economic disaster for Maine, and I would fight to save it.
Mr. Beardsley?
Yeah, part of my doctoral dissertation dealt with how that line affected the valuations of property in Township 16, Range 4. My concern is here you've got a state that's saying, oh, we want to support this rail line because of the forest industry. Then they turn around and threaten to reduce the Better Tax Reimbursement Program. They turn around to reduce the sales tax exemption for electricity for big paper companies, and then they turn around and say that if you have legal bonded labor from Canada, you're going to cut out the tree growth tax. I mean, that's the kind of confused, mixed policies that we're getting in state government.
Mr. Jacobson?
Sure. This railroad has been in bankruptcy or financial difficulty 3 times in the last 20 years. And each time, you've given them millions of dollars. 3 years ago, you gave them $7 million, and they're back to the table asking for more. 90% of the freight from that railroad goes out on a truck now. The reason a lot of the customers, and some absolutely need it, but the reason a lot of the customers like that railroad there is because it keeps their truck prices down. Okay? They can transload in Bangor, they can transload other places. We made a living on the St. Lawrence and Atlantic. Here's the biggest problem, though. We just set a precedent. Because the people that run the railroad that runs the spur into Madison or Bucksport, sure as we're sitting here, looked at what we just did, and they're going to come to the legislature in the next couple of years and say, we want $100 million to keep that line open going to Madison. Where does it stop? Too big to fail is no longer a workable concept. It didn't work at the federal government. It doesn't work in the state government.
Mr. LePage?
To me, I look at it a little differently than what you hear in here. I look at 35 years of one-party control who's been adversarial to business. For 35 years, they've hammered away at business. And no wonder there's no product to put on the rail lines. But in this particular instance, what concerns me greatly is the negotiations that's going on. There is 25 miles of that line from Madawaska to Van Buren that turns into Canada that's profitable, but that's being kept out of the deal. We're only buying the deadwood. I think we need some decent negotiators and say, if you want out, we'll buy it, but everything goes on the deal.
Mr. Mills?
Yeah, I agree with the decent negotiators part. That deal came together and was voted on by the legislature for a host of reasons. The deal on its surface didn't make sense, but it does now. The shippers came forward and said they would put $3 million into it. The federal government thinks it's an important line, and they have given indications that they will do their part toward the rehabilitation of the line. The line supports 22 major businesses and industries in Aroostook County. It's not the sole support. There are some businesses that could probably survive without that rail line, but there are some who could not. The bottom line, though, and the reason I voted for it, is because the amount of money that the state will pay for that line can be recovered because the state can take up the rail and sell it for almost as much as they're going to be putting onto the price of it, and they will have the right-of-way, which, as a right-of-way, is worth more than almost anything.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your responses. We appreciate the audience being here as well. A reminder, thank you. Just a quick reminder, too, that the Chamber will be hosting the debate for Democratic candidates for governor. That's Monday, May 3rd at 6:30 at the Gracie Theater at the Husson University campus, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce Eaton-Peabody Gubernatorial Primary Debate for the Republican Party, held at Rangeley Hall at the Eastern Maine Community College campus, located in Bangor, Maine. The candidates include William Beardsley, Steve Abbott, Paul LePage, Matt Jacobson, Les Otten, and Peter Mills. The Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce represents 800 members in 21 communities. For more information about the Chamber, please visit our website at bangorregion.com. Eaton Peabody can be found on the web at eatonpeabody.com. We'd like to thank Page Employment and Seaboard Security for their part in this production. We'd also like to thank My Video Productions for producing this program. MyVideoProductions.com is where you can find more information. Thank you for joining us for this program. We invite you to exercise your freedom to vote on June 8th. Thank you again for joining the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce Eaton Peabody Gubernatorial Debate.
.1 seconds left to go in this opening half.
Deep from Bangor's Heber, and looks like Larragay down there, and Prentice, and Blyer.
Here we
See if we
go.
can do something with that
The
ball.
line drive kick, and
He was going to pick it up and go with it.
tough to handle.
He's a quick young man. He's
He
going to
breaks
roll.
it.
Look at
Here
He
he
is
goes.
quick. He is quick.
Could be a big play. Game breaker right there. All the way.
Look at that young man.
Heber, touchdown with 5 seconds
Incredible
left.
run.
Incredible turn of events here at Cameron Field.
Can't that young man run?
And doesn't that change the feeling that Edward Little has to have going to the locker room? It definitely raises Bangor's hope.
I just had to give his father a high five. That was just a great run.
After 14 unanswered points from Edward Little, Heber finally injects a little enthusiasm into the
That brought the crowd.
Bangor bench.
And the crowd, Chris, they love
For
that
the
one.
first time tonight, I've heard the crowd roar. And Dow will be on for the kick, and wow.
I'd like to see a replay on that one.
Kick is up and good. Excuse me, that was Acorn.
That was nice.
Haven't seen Acorn in a while. Finally gets another kick
Gets
in.
another kick. That's right. Nice to see him back on the field. 21-14.
And what a turn of events. It's just the feeling going into the locker room has to be so different for the two clubs. Edward Little, 14 unanswered points. Their passing game looks solid. And then all of a sudden, kick off.
Bangor
and
comes back with that long run.
and that
long run
was,
by
for the most
Tyler.
part, generally a broken play. He dropped the ball.
Yeah.
He kinda,
Yeah,
and then he
maybe-
picked it right up, and got to give him credit. He never gave up, and woof.
Sometimes
all the
like
way
this-
down the field.
Sometimes like that, that distracts the defense coming down. They think they got an easy down.
That's another point. A lot of times you'll see it in the NFL. You'll see them talking about it. When early in the season or early in the game, you'll have guys coming on the kickoff, and they'll be going 100 miles an hour just trying to chop people's heads off.
Right.
And that's what happens. You over-pursue and
Pursue. It's a great point, Chris.
touchdown.
Now Bangor's going to kick off. Be curious if they're just going to scribble kick it or
4.5 seconds. Acorn.
no. He's going to boot it. Nice kick by Acorn.
And clock starts,
those
and
boys just
that's not going to be a repeat.
no. That's a nice gang tackle right there.
And that'll end the half.
Taken down by a big squad right there.
Bangor takes the lead with a touchdown at the end, 21-14 as we head to break. Prior to the second half, and
And just talking about that big run that he just had, that Heber kid, Tyler. What a great run that was, Chris.
it was quite a run, and we've concluded our first half of work here, and it's been quite an adventure and quite a pleasure at the same time, as this is the first time we've done something like this, and it's been quite a lot of fun, Eric.
Yes, it has, Chris. I didn't plan on being on the air here, but since your other man wasn't able to make it, I hope I'm not ruining it for everybody.
Oh, you've done a great job.